2.5, part 4. We're going to look at post and beam architecture with wood as opposed to what we looked at with post and lintel, which was stone. So, first, some of the first wood architecture that we're going to look at. So if you look here on our roof, and we're going to look at our example here in just a moment, see this slope roof? If you look at this diagram, you see how this slope that's coming off here, the beams going across here and across here and across here and across here, they are displacing the weight of the roof into these different regions, if that makes sense. So the post here, beam goes here, and there's multiple supports for this roof that we're looking at. So the roof is covered in ceramic tile. Don't get thrown off. This is a wood constructed building with some other, perhaps plaster and ceramic and some other things, but it is made of wood. The interior structure, the weight supported is post and beam. Okay, so this is a 1,400-year-old building, Horyu Temple in Nara, Japan, and it's very durable. It's lasted a long time. Now, in Japan, sometimes they do rebuild structures, but and still call it the same old structure. But in this case, this is an example that has lasted. Unfortunately, a lot of Japan, which was made out of wood, it's a heavily forested area. It rains every day almost in Japan. Trees grow really quickly. They have a lot of water, a lot of trees, a lot of wood architecture, but a lot of that burned at various points in time. Partly World War II, but there have been other fires that have burned Tokyo and so on. But a lot of this early architecture does not exist. We're going to look at the Taj Mahal, really gorgeous structure. Oh, yummy! So it's on a river here, and that's kind of hard to visualize sometimes. The other images we normally see on the other side of this, okay? So you have this gorgeous symmetry, and this is in India. We are not evolving architecturally the same way that we did in Europe. So there's some influence there, but this was built by the Mughals, which came from Persia, and came down into India and ruled India for a time. But this is a mausoleum or a memorial piece for Shah Jahan's wife. And this water that is here on the river, this is why I'm pointing this out, was important to build these support pilings underneath because the water would, rise and fall a little bit, but also all that erosion here could have really crumbled this beautiful building. So there's support pilings underneath the structure, and this is very common nowadays with our architecture, especially when we go into multi-storied buildings. All that pressure on the soil, depending on the type of soil or where we're building, if it's rock or whatever. But this is a gorgeous piece. It's a symbol of love, and it's all about Islamic symmetry, and it's built next to this river. So the river levels in this case are dropping, and it's jeopardizing these wooden support of this structure of these beams underneath. I think they're working on that, so don't worry too heavily on the Taj Mahal. I don't want you getting worried at this point. So our classic architectural styles were the Greek and Roman. They've endured so much time, and then we get back into Renaissance, and then we get the Romans, like I mentioned, get revived again in the 18th century. Renaissance is the 15th and 16th century. Then neoclassicism happens. This case, we're looking at a Renaissance piece of architecture in Italy, in Rome. And again, we have if we go back to the Pantheon with the Oculus, that building is still standing, and I don't know distance-wise, but I'm sure we could Google that nowadays. It never occurred to me to do that years ago when I was thinking about art history examples, but at any rate, it's probably walking distance from where the Pantheon is with that perfect dome. So you have these extant resources visually for you to look at and study and learn how to build. So Bramante here builds this very small structure with a dome, and using some of our columns here, if you look back to our Doric columns, very simplified here, but harkening back to our classical Greek and Roman architecture. So he's a high Renaissance guy, and this is supposedly where St. Peter was believed to have been crucified. This is also, connected to ancient Rome. We are in Rome, so it is the seat of Rome. The Colosseum, like I said, the Pantheon, but also the Colosseum are still there, and many other Roman structures. So it very well could be true. So a small little temple is built for St. Peter's site where he was crucified. This is later. Okay, so this is Neoclassicism, all right, which uses the Greek and Roman orders. And this is in London, and you see this a lot in London in the US. Think about the White House. Okay, that's a good example. A little bit later than this, but the same idea where we're hearkening back to these values of the Romans and the Greeks, and we admire this Roman Senate. We admire some of the ideals of that time, and we're trying to emulate those by building buildings in those styles. This is kind of clunky, I feel, but we still have our same thing with our entablature and our columns and so on. So we have like a little mini temple as a porch here, or an area where you would stand and look out. The rest of the building, I feel, is just kind of a box with some Greek and Roman elements on it. It's not very elegant, but you get the idea that it's popular at that time. So it's a reaction. Neoclassicism also has a political component, both in England and the U.S., where it's anti-Baroque and Rococo. When you think of the word Baroque, we haven't studied that yet, but you already kind of know what that meaning of that word is. It's over-the-top style. It's using just a ton of gold and ornate decoration. So we get into some politics later, but the idea is that this is more of a democratic, less of a hierarchical, meaning like a royal belief system. They're hearkening back to power to the people. So you're seeing that a bit in London, which still maintains its royal, status, but you see it also in the US. Here we go, the Industrial Revolution. There's so many cases where this book could almost be about the evolution of the Industrial Revolution. But the Industrial Revolution really starts back with the steam engine in the 1700s, which blows my mind. I don't know how many companies or people were using them. I couldn't really tell you, but as the 19th century rolls along, the steam engine enables a lot of the production of these things like iron and steel, and then concrete comes back into use. I think I said 20th, but late 20th century concrete starts to happen. And architects start to find new ways to control the tension and compression, right? So there's different ways to build. So one of them is balloon framing, and we see in this example in the stick-style house in Ontario, Canada, and a lot of Victorian and Edwardian buildings are built in this way. Big building boom in the 1800s. And you can see how these have a wood surface as well. Remember, we looked at our Japanese example. It had a ceramic tile surface, but this is almost entirely built out of wood. We have our posts here. We have our beams going across here, and it's basically built. I don't have a diagram at this point. So it's basically built where the 2x4s are building up the frame, and then it's filled in, just like buildings are built today. Invented in 1832, still used now, lightweight, and you can use power saws, which weren't in place before. You could even buy houses in kits back in the 1800s and early 1900s, and you can now too, but it was popular for a time because people would be in a remote area and they wouldn't have a Home Depot, they'd have to cut down a tree and do all the milling, which is time consuming, so you could just buy it already done and just put it together. So cast iron architecture gets into a different type of building. This is not really for homes. This is for larger structures, but cast iron has been around forever, but being able to pour it into a mold big enough for a building did not happen, okay? Because you couldn't smelt that large of a quantity, but now we've got the steam engine, we've got larger facilities for making iron, and we can make these larger structures. Now the Crystal Palace sadly doesn't exist today. This was in, I think it's Hyde Park in London, and this was part of an exposition that Victoria and Albert, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert hosted. The Great Exhibition of 1851 is where it was. And it doesn't say exactly, but I believe it's in the Hyde Park adjacent to one of the palaces. It could be seen from the palace. If you watch Victoria, if you watch that current series on PBS, it shows the building of this and what was entailed. Very controversial, very nerve-wracking for all involved because it hadn't been done before. We later got the Eiffel Tower with cast iron construction, but the idea was that it was very strong, had a lot of tensile strength, and didn't need a ton of support so that it could just be sheathed in glass. And it had a big open airy feel, and unfortunately it was torn down after the exhibition. Skeleton and skin, sorry. Skeleton and skin construction. So the skeleton is the iron and the skin would be the glass. Now other types of skin are going to come into play. It's also similar to balloon frame construction where it would be a wood frame and then wood skin, okay? Wood frame being the skeleton. But in this case, we're using cast iron and glass. Well, it was destroyed by fire. It was up for a while. So this influenced Gustav Eiffel, and the steel frame construction comes in after this. Don't get confused. Steel is made from iron, and it was a late 19th century, early 20th century material. It didn't exist in ancient times. It didn't exist in the 18th century. Steel is something that has less carbon, and it's more flexible, so it can be thinner, and it gets and it's quite strong. Okay, so our first steel constructed building, you'd have no idea because looking at it, it looks just like the other buildings around it. Now, I'm not sure on this building here or here, but I imagine that they're the same thing. But this is historically Louis Sullivan's Wainwright Building, 1890. This is our first steel frame building ever built. And it looks like a stone building because he wasn't really thinking yet the idea of using the openness for the windows and the ability to make thinner columns or thinner posts here to hold up the structure. That hadn't happened yet. So he still makes it, and it looks like a stone building, stacking and piling that are around him. But two things happen in this late 19th, early 20th century. One is the steel frame, and the other is the elevator. The invention of the elevator allows buildings to get taller. So he's the father of modernism. He pioneered this for the creation of skyscraper. It doesn't look like much of a skyscraper to us now, but you have to kind of put yourself in the context of history. And our exterior building reflects elements of a column. It still kind of looks like an older building. Later, we get into the international style, which is what we're looking at here. So we get into Mies van der Rohe. He's a huge architecture. He's kind of he's one of the primary big names in the international style of architecture. Look at all that glass. If you think back to the Crystal Palace, very similar in that sense, although this is steel and that was iron. So these are steel beams here, steel beam here. That could be, and I'm not sure from this photo, if memory serves, those are I-beams, and we get into I-beams a little bit more later on with skyscrapers, but Look at the openness and the light, and look at the interior, this big open span. Oh my gosh, just these few beams out here are holding up this whole structure. Look at the even open, it's open here on this corner. Just mind-boggling, okay? So that was a real innovation. The idea that you could have a glass house, less is more, because you really just want to show off the fact that these steel frames are carrying all the building's weight, and you're not facing it with stone and brick. So that is what Louis Sullivan did, is he did face his building with stone and brick. I'm going to backtrack for a second. He faced it to look like an old building with the stone and the brick here, but he didn't need to. Does that make sense? All right, massive. Oh my goodness. I think this is the tallest building in the world at the moment. By the time you read this, who knows? You know, it seems like things are changing so much. So Dubai, a concentration of wealth here and a concentration of people who are in a desert culture. 100 years ago, Dubai was just kind of looking like an adobe village. It's really wild how much this has changed. These waterways and so on are all fabricated. They're not natural. But the idea of building these really mega super tall buildings has become quite the tourist destination. But this is very classic with these steel construction. You can get very, very tall. The steel is strong. Of course, skinnier at the top, wider at the bottom to support the weight. But for quite a long time, you would simply see boxy structures that were, oh, maybe half this high. If you think of the Empire State Building and the World Trade Center and buildings like that, they were built in that way. So, tallest man-made structure in 2010. And some of the design is using the minarets from Islamic architecture. Tubular steel, making the support even lighter, so it's hollow steel supports. All right, Le Corbusier, I'm going to stop here.